Good evening, everyone, and thank you for joining us. I'm here, as always, with Dr. Justin Smith.
Good to be here.
How you been doing lately?
Okay, things are pretty good. You know, we're all feeling pretty good, and everybody's healthy, and school's kind of plugging along, so not too bad.
Yeah.
Not too bad.
I'm in the process of trying to grow a beard back, so
I was going to ask if this was
I
if
think
this was something that was like an ongoing project, or
I think so. So one of my friends told me it's best for me to cover as much of my face as possible. So thank you, thank you to my friend Kevin for that word of encouragement. So I'm going to be plowing along to get to that point.
have you given any thought to a length that you want to go, or
I haven't yet.
Okay.
Mandy will weigh in with her decisions on that, and her choices will win the day.
every marriage is a partnership
It is
in all things.
especially facial hair.
Yep.
I think it's a big conversation. So I don't know that she's super excited about the decision, but we'll go ahead and see what happens, see what comes of it. Just like as interesting as the story of my beard is, the book of Exodus is also fascinating. What a transition.
Well, I suspect there's a lot of beards in the book of Revelation.
There's a lot. There's a lot of beards going on. That's how I think of it, at least. So we have looked at the very beginnings of the book of Exodus and some important themes as we've entered in. We had a great conversation last time about God's name and what that means in Exodus chapter 3 and then chapter 4 as Moses has this encounter with God. And then Moses is called to do the thing that, honestly, if you really think about it, would be terrifying to do, to go to the most powerful person of their time and in that place and say, basically, God is taking this power away from you. And that is unbelievable to try and do, and it is something that I think we need to sometimes sit in a little bit of awe of, okay, like what would it look like for you to march up to one of the tyrannical, ruthless leaders of our day and say that to him. And I would say him, I can't really think of one that's a her necessarily, but
Sure.
as I think about a leader like that, the nature of this moment. And so we finally get to the conversation, this squaring off, and this has been set up as somewhat of this title bout between Pharaoh and Moses in Exodus chapter 5. And then what follows from Exodus chapter 5 all the way to Exodus chapter 13 is the 10 plagues. And over the next couple Bible studies, we'll be looking at some of the themes from these a little bit. As we have been trying to encourage you to do with the book of Exodus, please just read it. It's so important to think of it as a narrative, and just trying to think of like you entering into the story and thinking of the themes. And as we have mentioned, it's important for us to look at this from a 360-degree angle. I think oftentimes we want to identify with the Israelites, and there are points in all of our lives where we could do that. But it's also important for us, especially living in arguably the most powerful nation in human history, to think of ourselves as the Pharaoh character, as the Egyptians, the one who is oppressing. And we need to think of this from all angles because there's things for us to learn from all of those vantage points. And so Exodus chapter 5, as I said, begins this process of telling this story. And so I would encourage you to really read along. There's so much text that we won't be reading all of it in our next couple classes, but highlighting some things that we consider to be important. And I would just encourage you to be reading and thinking about this narrative and where we all intersect and interact with this story. So Exodus chapter 5, starting in verse 1. After this presentation to Israel's leaders, Moses and Aaron went and spoke to Pharaoh. They told him, "This is what the Lord, the God of Israel, says. Let my people go, so they may hold a festival in my honor in the wilderness." "Is that so?" retorted Pharaoh. "And who is the Lord? Why should I listen to him and let Israel go? I don't know the Lord, and I will not let Israel go." And I think this conversation is a backdrop for all of this, and I think something that is really going to come up over and over again throughout these chapters. Who is the Lord, basically?
Yeah.
Who is this God? Why would I listen to you guys? Why would I listen to that God? And I think it's really fascinating to think of Pharaoh as the way that our world today views God, where it's easy to stand at a distance, and we live in an increasingly, I would argue, just somewhat like Europe, a post-Christian type age, a post-religious type age, where we just ask this kind of question: what's the point? And recently, one of the words of the year was post-truth. That we live in a post-truth time, according to the Oxford Dictionary. And so we ask that question, and Pharaoh is very much a modern type person.
Mm-hmm.
He stands and says, what's the deal? Like, why should I listen to this God? Why should I allow this God to have authority over me? And what is offensive to him is not the idea of a god or a goddess existing. There are 114 gods and goddesses in Egypt, so he's not angry or upset about that. And basically, the Israelites were allowed to do whatever you want. This is very similar to Rome, how it was like, whatever, you guys can worship whoever you want to over there, as long as it doesn't mess with the way things are. And specifically in this instance, there's a lot of reason why the Israelites need to continue to be oppressed and made slaves. And so as long as you will just do your thing and not mess with us, whatever, you can do whatever you want. And I think that's very similar to the way that religion, that God is viewed in this time. Oh yeah, you guys can do whatever you want as long as you don't bring it to me or make me think about it.
Yeah.
And ultimately what is offensive to Pharaoh is this God has some sort of authority over me. What's the deal? And I think generally there'd be a similar sentiment with the way our world is today.
Well, I mean, it's also interesting too. One of the things that I think we struggle with in a modern context in thinking about religion in the ancient world is, one, not just the divine right of kings, meaning that kings rule because the gods or goddesses have made it so, but even the way that this sort of divine right of kings gets fused together in some cultures, in Egypt being one in particular, where the king himself or the queen herself is viewed as divine, or at least connected. So in some ways then, this interaction that we see with Pharaoh and Moses is not just a sort of sense of attack on the gods and goddesses of Egypt, sort of this crowded marketplace that you and I were talking about at one point, of sort of religious devotion or religious engagement, but it's also this idea of some God that Pharaoh doesn't know trying to exert power over his divine power, right? And again, it's sort of this interesting interplay of Moses and Aaron speaking truth to power, and power not being interested in that truth. And so it's how that then starts to unfold in this narrative, and this fairly transactional experience of religion in the ancient world, where gods and goddesses, you may or may not have a deep personal devotion to them, but you recognize their power in the world. And so your worship is really designed to stay on the right side of the gods and goddesses. And you give them worship, they bless you. You give them worship, they make the crops grow. You offer sacrifices, you offer incense, they're pleased, things go well. You rule if you're king because the gods and goddesses have made it so. And that whole sort of national power structure then is folded together with religious acknowledgement. It's, as you and I were talking, it's part of the reason why Israel many times has a wandering eye later on. They'll be looking around and going, there's all of these other nations that feel more powerful than us. Maybe it's because their God is better than ours. And so they'll certainly flirt at various points with other worship practices because They go, well, they seem to be working for others. Why can't they work for us? So there's something really unique, I think, in the way that the relationship between God and Israel is being explained here and expanded here and sort of worked out in Exodus and moving forward into sort of this unique relationship that God has with Israel. But it's also one that I think is different in many ways than what we typically see.
Yeah, and I think that word transactional is so often just the way that we live and breathe in our world. We expect quick transactions. We have technology, which is a great blessing, but if it's taking more than 2 seconds to send a text or whatever it is, we're thinking, what's happening? What's going on? And we live at this very fast pace. And so we have just this expectation, I think, of the transactional way that we view things. And then I think we carry that over into our view of religious practices.
Yeah.
And it is not healthy or helpful, I think.
Yeah.
And as I think about friends of mine who have walked away from faith for whatever reason, sometimes I think you've got a good reason. For whatever, that situation, that thing, it's possible that you have some valid points about this. But I think what's hard for me as I consider this and consider as a faith leader, what's hard for me is to see this lack of commitment and lack of ability to submit to any kind of authority. And what is tough for me is to think, I just don't know that that's actually leading you to a better life.
Yeah.
And sometimes we need to really think about where it is that we're going and not just about viewing something negatively, but what are you walking towards instead of just what are you walking away from?
Well, and it's just, to me, it's just sort of interesting in this world that we live in where everything is at our fingertips, especially in the West, where everything is instantaneous, and how much of that has sort of been brought on by the advent of the smartphone and apps. Our relationship with God is not an app. It is not click and send. It is not immediate in terms of its gratification. And I think the narrative that we start to see here in Exodus is one that is really built on and based on centuries worth of relationship between God and Israel, right? When God connects himself, when God is there in the burning bush and Moses is trying to figure out what's happening and who are you and how do I know? And one of the ways that God describes himself, and it's certainly one of the ways that we will continue to see God being described, I am the God of Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob. This is a God who is saying, I am connected to you as a people through space and time and relationship. And I am here and have been here. And I'm revealing myself to you now in a unique and powerful way. But this is not a new God, this is not a new thing, and this is not instantaneous. This is a relationship that has been built over centuries. And oh, by the way, as this story develops, we will see the way that this relationship with God and Israel develops over time. And it's not I've done something for you, you do something for me, instantaneous, we're done here, all parties are happy, let's move forward. It is a much more fraught relationship with ups and downs and back and forth and, for lack of better words, makeups and breakups. But it's a relationship that spans millennia. And it's not this sort of instantaneous thing that I think sometimes we're sort of captured by in the current moment. Yeah,
and I think it's interesting then to think about God in this way. What we see is Pharaoh presented as this anti-creation agent, where God, in the beginning of the book of Exodus, God is blessing the people and they're being fruitful and multiplying, and Pharaoh is trying to stamp that out. And then the creation basically turns against him, that the creation starts to totally change and adjust. And that begins with the first of what is called the plagues, and though sometimes it's called signs and wonders, but generally it's accepted that these 10 plagues happen, that they begin to somewhat announce God's presence to Pharaoh, and then the larger nation of Egypt. So Exodus chapter 7, starting in verse 14, is where this begins, the plague of blood. Then the Lord said to Moses, Pharaoh's heart is stubborn, and he still refuses to let the people go. And this is after Moses has performed some signs and wonders for Pharaoh. So go to Pharaoh in the morning as he goes down to the river. Stand on the bank of the Nile and meet him there. Be sure to take along the staff that turned into a snake. And then announce to him, the Lord, the God of the Hebrews, has sent me to you. Let my people go so they can worship me in the wilderness. Until now, you've refused to listen to him. So this is what the Lord says. I will show you that I am the Lord. Look, I will strike the water of the Nile with this staff in my hand, and the river will turn to blood. The fish in it will die, and the river will stink. The Egyptians will not be able to drink any water from the Nile. Then the Lord said to Moses, Tell Aaron, take your staff and raise your hand over the waters of Egypt, all its rivers, canals, ponds, and all the reservoirs. Turn all the water to blood. Elsewhere, everywhere in Egypt, the water will turn to blood, even the water stored in wooden bowls and stone pots. So Moses and Aaron did just as the Lord commanded them, as Pharaoh and all of his officials watched. Aaron raised his staff and struck the water of the Nile. Suddenly the whole river turned to blood. The fish in the river died, and the water became so foul that the Egyptians couldn't drink it. There was blood everywhere throughout the land of Egypt. But again, the magicians of Egypt used their magic, and they too turned water into blood. So Pharaoh's heart remained hard. He refused to listen to Moses and Aaron, just as the Lord had predicted. Pharaoh returned to his palace and put the whole thing out of his mind, which, how's that even possible? Then all the Egyptians dug along the riverbank to find drinking water, for they couldn't drink the water from the Nile. 7 days passed from the time the Lord struck the Nile. So this is an introduction of God's great power. Pharaoh has seen some of these acts, but this is on the larger scale in some ways to show the nation of Egypt. This is what God can do. This is what God's power is like. And this is the way that God will be introduced to you, basically. And it's this moment that is very significant. Everybody experiences it, suddenly everything changes as far as a life source for them.
Well, I think the thing for me that I just find really intriguing is the way that Pharaoh remains unimpressed or unmoved, unchallenged. I got guys who can do this.
Yeah.
Which, on one hand, I understand that response to a degree.
Well, and also, there are guys who can do this. That's interesting.
Right. I suppose we could unpack that a little bit.
Yeah.
But I got guys who can do this. But it's like, okay, I understand sort of recreating some element of this. But the narrative says, the Nile turned to blood, and water in, standing jars and pots turns to blood, and this, sort of corruption of water, which, again, it's really interesting just how important the Nile itself is to the ecosystem of Egypt. Mm-hmm. This is the central reality of life in Egypt is the Nile. The flooding of the Nile, the way that the Nile is used for travel, farming, so on and so forth, right? The Nile is incredibly important. Water is necessary for life.
And how is this not enough, right?
This would have, I again, maybe I don't have the cultural wherewithal, or I don't have that space as all powerful. This would have given me pause. You affect my water. I go, whoa, okay, let's come back to the bargaining table. Let's come back and talk a little bit. Let's see what's going on here. And his response is, I got guys who can do this. And so it again is sort of this interesting, and maybe, Brian, for us, the hard part is we, as powerful and as much power and determination, I think, as we have over our daily lives, you and I are not kings. I know this is shocking, but we're not kings.
Not even in our own household.
Typically not. So I don't know if it's the position. I don't know if it's sort of the experience of divinity that the Pharaoh has, his own feelings of power, for him to say, I am not compelled. I'm not changed by this moment. It really says something, I think, about Pharaoh. It really says something about his experiences with power. that this would not do it. And I honestly kind of, with the first plague, I would throw my hands up and go, okay, wait a minute, we have an issue here. Like this needs to get sorted out. There's something happening here that is miraculous and powerful and different and challenging. What do we do? So I don't know. I mean, I kind of shake my head a little bit. I mean, because it's just going to get worse. I mean, this is, and somehow turning the Nile into blood is not the worst thing that happens, which is strange to think, but yeah.
Yeah, I think that as I continue to look at this, also you start with the Nile to blood, the plague of frogs, gnats, flies, the plague on livestock. Those are the first five, and it's just interesting to watch how these things get taken away, and what he does is digs his heels in, basically, and doesn't change. And I think that's something that we need to really think about and consider in our hearts. Like, how are there some things maybe that God is showing you? And I think we think of grace as this just really a good thing, perhaps, and we think of it as like a nice idea, but there's the other side of God, the fear of God, the holiness, that God desires worship, and that we have to live with an awareness of what God can do in power, and what are some areas, perhaps in your heart and my heart, where I've dug my heels in a little bit, and there's been some stuff that God is perhaps saying to me, don't live there, don't stay there. And you need to be careful about that. You need to think through this. And I think I don't always do a good job of hearing that and making that change. And when you see it in Pharaoh, it's easy to say, oh, what a terrible person. I can't believe that. But I don't know that we have an active enough imagination to think of God really teaching us things. And okay, there's some certain things that you need to adjust and change and work on.
Yeah. Well, it's to me, what's really interesting as you were talking, kind of what was kind of coming together for me is in chapter 5, Moses and Aaron go to Pharaoh and they say, the Lord, is saying, let his people go so they can go worship in the wilderness for a few days. And Pharaoh's response is, who is this God that I should care? And in chapter 7, God is showing, this is who I am that you should care, right? I mean, how many times in our lives have we called on God to intervene? Have we called on God to be present? Have we called on God to show himself? Have we called on God to sort of lead us to understanding God better? And God is there, and God shows us, and God intervenes, and we remain unconvinced, unmoved.
Yeah.
Right? Unchanged, unchallenged. and so on the one hand, again, it's easy to look at Pharaoh and again, as we just sat here and said, water turns to blood. I'm listening. But we have called on God at many points in our lives, myself included, and said, where are you? Show me who you are.
Yeah.
God shows us, and we kind of go, okay, yeah, well, I need more than that. And so again, it's sort of this interesting space that we find ourselves in as we are maybe on the one hand really seeking to see God and experience God and know God, and God shows up in sometimes very subtle ways, sometimes very overt ways, and we still go, I need more than that. So I don't know, I mean, it's this really sort of challenging teaching moment to really, as you said at the very beginning, not to be putting ourselves in the shoes of, in the experiences of the marginalized, but to be putting ourselves in the experience of the empowered and the powerful, because that's where we reside, and it's why we remain so hard to convince.
Yeah, and I think of just what we've learned in this past year. I think that there was this idea that we all collectively had, that we're progressing to this better place, and as a society, we're just getting better and better and better. And I think this year has brought us to our knees. It's been a year of plagues in some ways, where we have thought at times, can this get any worse? It's bad, and then something else happens, and we think, oh, that might as well have happened. And I think we have to really not just be unchanged then.
Yeah.
And I think that there's a calling on all of our lives to really think about, all right, what things have we learned and gained from this time that we, as we enter into a new normal at some point. I was too busy before. I was running around like a chicken head with my head cut off. What am I going to put back into my life that I can be more intentional about? As we think about some of the hard things we've learned about racism and the ways that certain groups of people are looked over in the large majority, we need to listen to those voices and adjust and make changes. We can't just go back to the way things were. And I think oftentimes what has happened for us in a post-Christian world is people have been let down by institutions, and that includes churches, politics, these different things. And there's research about this all over the place about how there's just less participation in communal type events. And so people have walked away. And again, just what is it that you're walking toward, basically? If you've decided, I'm going to give up on this and I'm going to go do this, it's like, as a pastor, I hope I'd have the humility to say, all right, well, they're going somewhere better. But even previous to COVID, anxiety was extremely high. Suicide, depression, it's extremely high. And I think we need to really challenge ourselves about what God has taught us through some of these events of this last year that we really need to take with us. We are people that are unsettled and anxious, and I think we start with that question of post-truth, like, who is God? Like, why would I listen to this? My grandma did this, my grandpa, but what's the point? And I don't know that we're going somewhere better. I don't think we've arrived at something better.
Yeah. Well, I think, again, it's really sort of interesting, even as we've talked privately in sort of some of our own conversations about where we see all of this going, once we sort of get back to whatever normal looks like. Do we forget, or are we going to forget the things that we've learned over this last year? So I personally have wrestled with and dealt with depression and anxiety a good portion of my life. And it has really only been in the last couple of years that I've been able to really acknowledge that and understand that. And in many ways, this last year has sort of brought me into a better understanding of that, just with myself, and then also dealing with students who are dealing with a wide variety of mental health issues and other experiences, that have been exacerbated by this. And so it's just, to me, it's as we're going through these things, what are we learning?
Yeah.
How are we growing? How are we being changed? And I think that's an incredibly important thing for us to continue to think about, that if there are things that we have come to understand better about ourselves and God in this process, let's not leave them in quarantine. Like, let's not leave them in this time.
Yeah.
Let's bring them through. And I think it's this interesting way, as these narratives are unfolding in Exodus, it's not only what are we as readers learning about God in this, as God is revealing himself in various ways, but it's also drawing us into what is Pharaoh learning about God in all of this. But what are the people learning about God in all of this? Because you cannot tell me that the people have not lost faith, that their relationship with God has not waned, that their experience has not been tested and tried and stretched to the breaking point, so much so that they're not sure what to think when all of this is happening. And yet it is a God who remains infinitely patient as he is sort of sometimes pushing us through, pulling us through, drawing us through these really difficult spaces, sometimes with us, sometimes despite us, sometimes, in a community with us. But it's the way that this is being revealed, I think, is really powerful.
Yeah, and it's important for us to not walk out of any sort of painful situation unchanged, whatever that happens to look like. And as we think about suffering and these kinds of things in the world, we don't necessarily want to think about the ways that God allows this stuff and what that looks like. I think it's a really complex topic, but there is stuff that we can learn from pain, and there are things that God is wanting for us to listen. I think of the quote by Pascal, I believe from the 1700s, all of humanity's problems come from not being able to sit in a quiet room alone.
Yeah.
And I think that the same thing is true. And it's crazy to think about that was said in the 1700s. And what did you have to do, basically? But as we think about what that is and looks like in the future for us all, like how could you sit in a quiet room alone and say, God, what are you teaching me from this moment?
Yeah.
What can I grow from? I'm not just going to worship you when things are good. I'm going to consider what you're teaching me through this stuff, and I'm going to humble myself. I'm going to be willing to do that, and that's hard to do.
Yeah.
And we need some of these idols broken down in our own hearts.
I would just say, don't waste your pain. The reality is that we are all going to have pain and suffering, some incredibly great and excruciating, some physical, some emotional, but we're all going to experience pain. And to me, it's going back to this idea of, as we've talked many times, we worship a God who stands in solidarity with us in our pain and suffering because that God has experienced pain and suffering. Mm-hmm. And as we experience pain, don't waste it. Don't waste it. It can change you for the better, or at least it can draw you into a better understanding of who you are in relationship to God. So if we're going to have pain and suffering, and we are, then don't waste it. Because to me, pain and suffering without purpose is pretty intolerable. Mm-hmm. But pain and suffering that is transformed through purpose, even if it's purpose that comes on the other side of that pain and suffering, is something that is potentially life-giving and liberating.
Yeah. And I think that's key for us to think about. What ways is God using some hard things perhaps to teach you something, and there's stuff to be gained from the good and the bad. And I think that as we think about the ways that God does these things to Pharaoh, we need to consider those things for our own hearts and lives. And so what do you need to sit with alone in a room and say, God, what do you have to teach me from this situation? That's the time that we have for this evening. We're thankful for you joining us. As always, you're welcome to join us at 8 p.m. for our prayer call, which you can get the information for. You can send me an email, Brian with a Y, at glendale.church for the Zoom link, and you're welcome to join us. Let me say a word of prayer over us as we conclude our study tonight. God, we're thankful for the book of Exodus, which challenges us, and I pray that we would consider how you are calling us to grow, even in painful things and difficult things. We want to be able to sit in a quiet room alone and think about you in the good times and the bad times. We want to learn from the things that you're calling pride out in all of us, and we just pray that you would be with us as we're challenged in that. God, we continue to just lift up the world right now as the struggle with coronavirus continues, and we pray over all those who've been affected, and we just pray your blessings on our world right now. In your son, Jesus' name I pray, amen.
Amen.
Thank you guys for joining us this evening.
Thank you.